Sarah Ferguson just made a claim the palace will hate. After decades of silence, the Duchess of York is now suggesting the royal family didn't just abandon her, they destroyed her life. And with new investigations dragging old scandals back into the spotlight, her words are detonating across royal headlines again, because this isn't just a comeback interview. It's a reframing of one of the most controversial royal sagas of the modern era, and the timing is no coincidence. Fresh scrutiny surrounding Prince Andrew is pulling long-buried associations back into public view, with renewed attention on Epstein-linked networks and historic connections. Every time those investigations resurface, the ripple effect widens, and this time, Sarah Ferguson isn't staying in the background. Instead, she's stepping forward with a narrative shift that changes the lens entirely. Not the disgraced former royal, not the chaotic outsider, but someone positioning herself as a casualty of the same institution that once crowned her. To understand why this moment is exploding, you have to go back to where it all began. In 1986, Sarah Ferguson walked into Westminster Abbey as a royal bride, instantly becoming one of the most recognizable women in the world. The public adored her. She was vibrant, unfiltered, and refreshingly human compared to the rigid royal mold. But beneath the fairy tale optics, the pressure was already building, because entering the monarchy doesn't just elevate you, it reshapes you. And not everyone survives that transformation intact. Even during her early royal years, financial patterns were emerging that would later define her public downfall. Lavish spending habits, high-profile shopping sprees, and mounting debts began surfacing behind the palace walls. Reports over the years painted a picture of escalating costs tied to luxury wardrobes, extravagant gifting, and lifestyle expenses that blurred the line between royal privilege and personal liability. And unlike senior royals with tightly structured systems, Ferguson often existed in a financial gray zone, partially protected but never fully insulated. By the mid-1990s, that instability reached a breaking point. Financial interventions reportedly came from within royal circles, but when her divorce from Prince Andrew was finalized in 1996, the dynamic shifted overnight. The institutional buffer that once softened public fallout was gone. And that moment became the first real turning point, because from then on, Sarah Ferguson wasn't navigating scandal inside the monarchy. She was navigating it alone, with a royal title, but without royal protection. And instead of retreating, she reinvented. Moving primarily to the United States, Ferguson launched a second act built on media visibility and commercial ventures. Endorsements, publishing deals, talk show appearances. She leaned into a new identity, former royal turned global personality. For a while, it worked. She built income streams, maintained relevance, and carved out a lane few royals had ever attempted. But beneath the reinvention, the instability never fully disappeared. Behind the scenes, financial turbulence kept resurfacing in cycles. Lawsuits over unpaid invoices, business ventures that collapsed under pressure, charitable efforts that drew scrutiny over transparency. Each chapter followed a familiar rhythm, reinvention followed by fallout. And compiler each cycle, public sympathy eroded. The narrative was shifting from misunderstood royal to chronic controversy. Then came the scandal that permanently altered her reputation. In 2010, a covert sting operation captured Ferguson in a globally explosive moment involving access to Prince Andrew. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Headlines detonated. Apologies followed. And Ferguson later described it as her lowest point, a moment she framed as driven by desperation. But what complicated that narrative was what emerged alongside it, her proximity to Jeffrey Epstein. Because even after Epstein's conviction became public knowledge, connections and communications continued surfacing in later document releases and investigative reporting. Over time, those revelations created a tangled timeline that refused to fade. Was she a peripheral figure caught in a larger scandal, or someone whose repeated financial crises pulled her into deeply questionable circles? That ambiguity has haunted her public image ever since. And now, that ambiguity is back under the microscope. Newly surfaced materials and renewed institutional scrutiny are forcing a re-examination of that entire era. Not through tabloid whispers, but through archived records and investigative frameworks. Emails, financial references, and historical associations are being revisited with fresh context. And when stories move from gossip to documentation, they gain a different kind of gravity. This is where the story takes its biggest turn, because instead of quietly weathering the storm, Sarah Ferguson is pushing a counter-narrative. She's reframing her past not as a series of isolated failures, but as the byproduct of systemic pressure. The idea that the same institution that elevated her also left her exposed once she no longer fit its image. It's a powerful pivot, shifting the focus from personal collapse to institutional consequence. And that pivot lands differently today than it would have years ago. Public attitudes toward powerful institutions have shifted dramatically. Audiences are more willing to interrogate legacy systems, including monarchies, than at any point in recent memory, which means Ferguson's attempt to reposition herself isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening in a climate primed for reevaluation. But the complexity of her story makes any single narrative difficult to dominate, because alongside claims of institutional abandonment are decades of documented financial instability, collapsed ventures, mounting liabilities, recurring controversies tied to money. These aren't isolated incidents. They form a continuous thread that complicates attempts to reframe the story purely through victimhood. That tension is exactly why public reaction feels so divided right now. Some see a cautionary tale of what happens when fame and financial mismanagement collide. Others see someone who entered an unforgiving system without the structure needed to survive it. And then there's a third perspective, one that sees her as a symbol of a broader royal paradox, insiders who are simultaneously privileged and precarious. The renewed scrutiny around Prince Andrew intensifies that paradox, because despite their divorce, Ferguson's life has remained intertwined with his through family ties, shared history, and overlapping reputational fallout. And every new development tied to Andrew pulls her back into the gravitational field of controversy. The stories don't exist in isolation, they orbit each other, and that overlap has real consequences beyond headlines. Reports of dissolving companies, shrinking partnerships, and mounting financial strain suggest fallout that isn't just reputational, it's structural. Once credibility erodes at that level, rebuilding it becomes exponentially harder. Opportunities narrow, alliances shift, and reinvention, once her greatest strength, becomes increasingly difficult. From a media perspective, this moment represents a major narrative shift. For years, Sarah Ferguson occupied a strange space, not fully royal, not fully removed, a peripheral figure oscillating between nostalgia and scandal. But this resurgence is repositioning her story from footnote to focal point. Not just a colorful royal sidebar, but a central cautionary arc in the modern monarchy. And that reframing raises a deeper question. How durable is royal proximity over time? Early in her life, it created opportunity. Later, it created expectation. And eventually, it amplified consequences. That evolution reflects something fundamental about the monarchy's modern reality. Proximity magnifies everything, privilege and fallout alike. Looking forward, the trajectory of this story remains highly unpredictable. One possibility is that ongoing investigations tied to Epstein-era networks continue resurfacing historical connections, keeping Ferguson tethered to an endless cycle of rediscovery. Another is that her decision to speak now signals a deliberate attempt to reclaim narrative control, shifting from reactive damage control to proactive legacy shaping. There's also the reputational wildcard. Public memory is volatile. Some figures outlast scandal through reinvention, others become permanently defined by it. Where Ferguson ultimately lands may depend less on any single revelation and more on whether this story continues resurfacing in waves. Because in the digital era, narratives rarely disappear. They pause, and that may be the most revealing part of this entire moment. Not just the details, but the endurance. Decades after her royal wedding, Sarah Ferguson is still navigating the consequences of choices made across multiple eras of her life. Different decades, different crises, same unresolved arc. That continuity suggests something larger than scandal. It suggests a legacy still unfolding in real time. Because in the end, this isn't just about one former duchess trying to rewrite her story. It's about how proximity to power can elevate, distort, and ultimately complicate a lifelong after the spotlight fades. And now, with Sarah Ferguson breaking her silence and reframing her role in a saga that refuses to stay buried, one thing feels undeniable. The royal chapter may be decades old, but its consequences are still being written.